What do the Bible stories of Moses, David, and the prophets teach about the relationship that God wants with humanity? So let's remember that God has established covenants or agreements with key people in the Bible. Now, the first man and the first woman, they had an implicit covenant with God in the garden, which they broke. Then God made a covenant with Noah to never let the world descend into destruction again. And God made a specific personal promise to Abraham that he would have a promised land for his many descendants, a great nation of people to live in. Now, the covenant on Mount Sinai is a little different. It's a covenant between God and his people, Israel, and it establishes the people of Israel as a free people who are under God's protection, if they want to be, by following the commandments that he has given. When God finds David, his people are in need of a king. The first king has not trusted or loved God, but tried to do things his own way. So God goes looking for someone who understands how good and trustworthy God is. And he finds David. The same pattern that we saw earlier in the Bible unfolds in the same way with David. God chooses the youngest son, the shepherd, the smallest, the least noticed. God tells Samuel that God doesn't judge people like humans do, but God looks at the heart. And in his heart, David loves and trusts God. David writes songs about God's love. He does his work with humility. And David trusts God to protect him from danger. This trust allows God to work with David, to cooperate with David's freedom. And that's what Israel's kings need. Israel's king needs to be able to trust and follow God so that God can pour out his goodness for all the people. We see that God protects David from Goliath, the giant. Because Goliath has insulted God and his people, God gives David the courage and strength to defeat him. David continues to fight for his people, and God continues to give him victory. Now, King Saul becomes jealous of David, but God protects David from Saul's attempts to kill him. Although he is exiled from his country and hunted by Saul, David still trusts in God's protection. David's ultimate act of humility is when he spares Saul's life when he has a chance to kill him. David says he will never attack God's anointed king, even if Saul has unjustly attacked him. Again, this humility and obedience allows for God to choose David to replace Saul as king. David unites the whole country of Israel, wins victory after victory, and establishes a capital city, Jerusalem, all with God's help. So let's review what God has done for David. First of all, God chooses David as a king while David was still just a young, smelly, know-it-all shepherd. God protects him against wild animals and Goliath and gives him victory. God protects him from King Saul, who tried to kill him. God even allows Saul to die in battle with his enemies so that David could become king. God unites the country under David as king. For the first time, all of Israel is united in strength. And God gives David many victories over all his enemies. When David has obeyed, trusted, and accepted everything that God has done for him, God makes David a promise. On his own, God makes the promise that even if David and his sons sin, God will never take back his promise to set up an everlasting kingdom. Under a faithful king, God's plan for humanity can be fulfilled, a plan of peace and justice, where humans cooperate with God to make creation good. One of David's sons will be king, and that kingdom will last forever. Overwhelmed by this message, David prays that he is not worthy, and that God's name will be praised forever because God did this for his people. David says that God always keeps his promises, and now God has made this wonderful, incredible promise to him. So there's at least two levels on which we can learn about God from this story. One is to see that God has a plan in mind to be fulfilled in Jesus. Jesus is the Son of David who will always trust and follow God the Father. And so Jesus can be the king of God's people. Remember that 1,000 years before Jesus, God makes this promise to David, who is an ancestor of Jesus. Now, the other thing we can learn is that God, again, is amazing in how generous he is. David utterly depends on God, and really the only thing he does is trust God. None of David's successes and victories can be accomplished without God. And then God adds to what he gives David, an everlasting kingdom in David's name for God's people. Everlasting. Lasting forever. No earthly nation can ever hope to last forever. And yet God promises that this exact kind of kingdom to David on earth. So Christians see in the Davidic Covenant both an affirmation of Jesus, who fulfills the promise of an everlasting kingdom, and we also identify with David, who was singled out and honored because he trusted God. David's trust in God foreshadows Jesus' relationship with God the Father and also serves as an example for us. If we trust God like David and Jesus did, God will always protect and guide us. So I invite you to consider and reflect on the question, what does the Davidic Covenant teach us about God?